Good evening. You're listening to Adrenaline Radio, 1680 on your AM dial. My name is Fred Blanchard. I'm your host for Adrenaline Motorsports. One of the sponsors that I have here, Arias Pistons, and kind of given a little bit of his history as to how he got started in the piston business, and then during that same era, after 1969, as the piston business grew, he also got curious about manufacturing other items such as cylinder heads for the big block Chevrolet, but they just weren't a standard cylinder head. It was a cylinder head designed with a hemispherical combustion chamber, which is very important in high performance. And that was proven by the Chrysler company that if you were going to go racing, you wanted something with a hemispherical design chamber. And you found only that in the Dodge and the DeSoto and the Chrysler engines of that era, which was starting out in the early 50s, and in the late 50s was the Chrysler 392. And so Arias decided to build this cylinder head for the Chevrolet big block, and he was very, very innovative. Surround himself with some pretty key people, and as I mentioned early on, he had his son and Tom Roberts in the pattern shop, and he had another gentleman by the name of Rudy Moeller, which was very keen on cylinder head design, and he, along with Rudy and Nick, installing his ideas and getting some guidance from Rudy Moeller, some drawings were compiled, and then from the drawings, prints were compiled. The feasibility drawings, which is what they were called. The feasibility drawing to design something, it shows all aspects of the part that you feel is going to work and all the dimensions along with that particular item all in one page. You could see the angle and the flow of the port, the valve, an obscure vision of the valve. Today you can do it with a computer, and they do it with layers, and you use AutoCAD or a variety of other programs in which to do it with, but in a period of actually 6 months, the cylinder head was designed, and from that cylinder head design, they made what we call a flow box. They took one of the 4 cylinders on the cylinder head, and they put the valves at the angle they felt it needed to be. They in turn made the combustion chamber as it was a hemispherical combustion chamber. And then these parts were made out of wood, but there were actually metal valves in there, so they could go up and down with springs. And they would put them on a flow bench until they got the proper flow. What did they use as a guideline was the Chrysler head, of course. They took the Chrysler head and they flowed it. They just didn't pick any Chrysler cylinder head. They took a Chrysler head that was ported and flowed by a Chrysler engineer by the name of Mullins. He in the day was the premier cylinder head man for Pro Stock, and he had the best cylinder head available. And Nick Arias was fortunate enough to have a friend of his have a copy of the latest head, and they tested the flow figures, and then they said, okay, this is our guideline. This is what we're going to do. We want to have a head equal to this, but we want to improve upon it as best we possibly can. And so they started designing this head and the port, and once they got the flow figures, their goal was 25% better than the best Chrysler head out there for Pro Stock racing at the time. And the best they could achieve was 13%. And they decided to go with it from beginning of the design work, from the patterns to a finished product. They had a completed cylinder head assembly, including rocker arms, valve covers, intake manifold, valley cover for the head, for the block. All that was completed in 6 months. And they decided to assemble this head and apply it to an engine block, which they had purchased, and they had added a 1-inch thick plate on top of this engine block and actually built an engine with that plate on top of it with these heads attached to it. And they ran it on nitromethane. And there were a couple of engines that they had built. One was for funny car, one was for dragster, and the dragster was what they call the over-the-hill gang car, which is in the Hot Rod Museum today, with the same number one engine that was built by Arias, and it still runs today as a display engine as well. They started up at some of the events, but that engine is the number one engine. And the second engine that was built was in a car that was out of Arizona called Power Steel, and it was a car that was built for funny cars, and this engine was in that car too. And both of these succeeded quite well, and the first test of the car set the low ET top time of an event in the dragster, and the funny car did the same thing. But again, as parts go in manufacturing, they were using high-performance cylinder heads and pistons and rods, but unfortunately the engine block wasn't a high-performance block. So they had problems with the block, so then they decided to start building their own block. So it evolved from a parts business to manufacturing complete engines. The Arias Chevrolet was only the beginning. The second engine that was built by Arias was called the Arias 8.3 liter, which was a solid block and solid head configuration strictly for drag racing. And its configuration was a little bit different. They were still the Hemi-chambered heads, but the heads were taken from the original Hemi Chevy and narrowed up a little bit, and but the chambers were the same, and the intake manifold was a little bit different, and they used that, and then they decided to go drag racing. But the thing was that how they went drag racing was quite unique in itself, and I think Steve Montrelli told that story a few weeks ago here on air, that he went from boat to boat. They started out wanting to put this motor in a boat, and then they had to go back and go to the boat races and make the presentation of the engine, and made a deal with the boat owner that if he could outperform what they had just set the record with, would they buy an engine. And they finally convinced the boat owner that yes, they would, and they went out and set the record higher than what they'd ever had before with an Arias engine, and that was the beginning of the sale of the Arias engines. During that same era, Arias also developed two other engines, and one was the Arias 10-liter, which was an offshore boat engine, which was totally the Arias design. It wasn't a Chevrolet block, it wasn't a Ford block, it wasn't a any kind of a block. It wasn't Chrysler or anything. It was an all Arias. And its uniqueness was that the camshaft was completely out of what we call the lifter galley, which is the center of the engine between the two cylinder heads. It raised up real high, and it minimized the engine harmonics, which was a big thing at that time. And it was an extremely powerful engine, and it was found they were trying to sell into the offshore boat engine marketplace, where you have the wealthy people basically running against jet engines and what have you, and that engine was designed for that purpose. The other engine that was developed out of Arias was a Ford engine, and it was a connection with Ford Motor Company and the Allen Root family, and that was in the early development stages there at Arias, and Arias relinquished his portion of the ownership to the Root family later on, but the engine had run in pro stock, and it was quite successful at the time. But again, these are the things that came out of Arias manufacturing, and I call it Arias Industries, but it was Arias Pistons at first, and then Arias Racing Engines. And today it's evolved back into another facet. The Arias Hemi Chevy has evolved. They've redesigned the valve train assemblies, and it's a primary component for street rod engines and also drag racing and what have you. And also Arias has recently developed a Hemi head for the LS Chevrolet small block. It's just been released, and it's something that it's going to be on the Arias website. And I would say that if anyone has interest, log on to Nick Arias Jr. Racing Components, and there's some photos up there now for you to review.